There are houses that stand as silent witnesses to generations, their foundations steeped in the echoes of lives lived, joys celebrated, and sorrows endured. And then, there are houses that seem to remember, to breathe, to whisper the stories of their past, not just in the rustle of old curtains or the groan of ancient floorboards, but in a more insidious, unsettling way. This is the tale of a childhood home, a place that should have been a sanctuary of warmth and security, but instead became a chilling repository of unseen presences and unsettling murmurs, a place where the very walls seemed to whisper secrets that were never meant to be heard. Our story begins with a young family, a mother, a father, and their two children, a boy named Ethan and his younger sister, Lily, moving into an old, Victorian-era house on the outskirts of a quiet, tree-lined town. The house was a grand, imposing structure, with tall, narrow windows that seemed to gaze out with an ancient wisdom, and a sprawling garden that hinted at forgotten beauty. It had stood empty for years, its windows like vacant eyes, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, a silent testament to a past that no one in the town seemed willing to discuss. The real estate agent had been unusually evasive, quick to change the subject whenever the house's history was brought up, and the neighbors, though polite, offered only vague smiles and hurried goodbyes when the family tried to inquire about the previous occupants. Despite the subtle warnings, the family was drawn to its undeniable charm, its spacious rooms, and the promise of a fresh start. They saw potential, a canvas upon which to paint their new life, unaware that the house already had a masterpiece of its own, painted in shadows and whispers. From the moment they moved in, a subtle strangeness began to permeate the air. It wasn't anything overt at first, just a feeling, a prickle at the back of the neck, a sense of being watched, even when alone. Lily, being the younger and more sensitive of the two children, was the first to articulate it. She would often talk about her. Every house has its secrets, its hidden corners and forgotten spaces. But some secrets are not meant to be discovered, and some spaces are not meant to be entered. This is the story of a childhood home where the most terrifying secret was not buried in the past, but living, breathing, and waiting in the darkness above. A silent, unseen resident in the one place a child should feel safest, their own home. Our story centers on a young boy named Leo, a curious and imaginative child of about 10, who lived with his parents in a sprawling, two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was old but well-maintained, with a large, inviting backyard and a sense of peaceful normalcy that belied the chilling secret it held. Leo was a solitary child, content to spend hours in his room, building elaborate Lego castles and drawing fantastical creatures in his sketchbook. His room was on the second floor, directly beneath the attic, a space that was, for all intents and purposes, off-limits. His parents had told him it was filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and dangerous, exposed nails, a place where he could easily get hurt. But for Leo, the attic was a source of endless fascination, a mysterious, unexplored territory that called to his adventurous spirit. He would often lie in his bed at night, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the creaks and groans that were a familiar comfort. But sometimes he would hear other sounds that were not so easily explained. Faint, shuffling footsteps from directly above his head, as if someone were pacing back and forth in the darkness. A low, guttural humming, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ceiling, a sound that made the hairs on his arms stand on end, and sometimes a faint, rhythmic creaking, like an old rocking chair, swaying back and forth in the dead of night. He would tell his parents about the sounds, his voice a hushed whisper in the darkness, but they would always dismiss his fears, attributing them to an overactive imagination, or the house's old pipes, or the wind rattling the eaves. They would tuck him in, kiss him goodnight, and tell him not to worry, that he was perfectly safe, unaware of the true horror that was unfolding just a few feet above their heads. One rainy afternoon, when his parents were out running errands, Leo's curiosity finally got the better of him. He found the key to the attic, hidden away in a dusty old box in his father's study, and with a sense of both excitement and trepidation, he made his way to the attic door, a small, unassuming panel in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. He pushed a chair underneath it, climbed up, and with a trembling hand he turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a set of rickety, pull-down stairs that disappeared into the darkness above. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and began to climb, each step a creak of protest in the silent house. The attic was just as his parents had described it, a vast, dusty space filled with old furniture draped in white sheets, like silent, sleeping ghosts. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, and the only light came from a single, grimy window at the far end of the room, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed with every movement. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he began to explore, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He found old photo albums, filled with pictures of people he didn't recognize, their faces smiling out from a forgotten past. He found a box of his father's old model airplanes, their wings coated in a thick layer of dust. And then, in the farthest, darkest corner of the attic, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a small, makeshift room, hidden behind a stack of old mattresses. The walls were covered in strange, unsettling drawings, crude, childlike figures with distorted faces and hollow, empty eyes. In the center of the room was a small, child-sized bed, its sheets stained and torn. And on the bed, a single, tattered teddy bear, its button eyes staring blankly into the darkness. A wave of unease washed over him, a feeling that he was intruding on something private, something sacred, something deeply, profoundly wrong. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and as he turned to leave, he saw it. A small, wooden rocking horse, its paint peeling, its eyes wide and staring, and it was rocking, back and forth, with a slow, rhythmic creak that seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. A sound he had heard so many times from his room below. Terrified, he scrambled down the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind reeling from what he had seen. He slammed the attic door shut, locked it, and put the key back where he had found it, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold it. He didn't tell his parents what he had seen. He couldn't. He knew they wouldn't believe him, that they would just dismiss it as another one of his stories, another product of his overactive imagination. So he kept it to himself, a dark, chilling secret that festered in his mind, a secret that made him feel like a stranger in his own home. After that day, the sounds from the attic became more frequent, more insistent. The footsteps were heavier, the humming louder, the rocking more frantic. And sometimes he would hear a new sound, a faint, high-pitched whimpering, like a child crying in the darkness, a sound that tore at his heart and filled him with a profound sense of dread. He started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams of a small, shadowy figure with hollow, empty eyes, a figure that would stand at the foot of his bed, watching him, its silent gaze filled with an ancient sorrow, a silent plea for help that he could not answer. Years passed, and Leo grew into a teenager, his childhood fears fading into the background of his busy life. He still heard the sounds from the attic, but he had learned to ignore them, to block them out, to dismiss them as the ramblings of an old, creaky house. He had convinced himself that what he had seen in the attic that day was just a trick of the light, a product of his childish imagination, a story he had made up to scare himself. He had buried the memory deep within his subconscious, a dark, forgotten corner of his mind. One day, when he was home alone, he heard a loud crash from the attic, a sound so violent it shook the entire house. He rushed upstairs, his heart pounding in his chest, a sense of dread washing over him. He found the attic door ajar, a faint light spilling out from the darkness above. He cautiously climbed the stairs, his senses on high alert, his mind racing. The attic was in disarray, the old furniture overturned, the dusty boxes scattered across the floor. And in the center of the room, lying on the floor, was a small, frail old man, his body twisted and broken, his eyes wide and staring, a silent testament to a life lived in darkness and isolation. It was later discovered that the man had been living in the attic for years, a homeless drifter who had broken in and made a home for himself in the forgotten space. He had been the source of the footsteps, the humming, the rocking, He had been the man in the attic. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. In the small, makeshift room, hidden behind the mattresses, the police found a collection of children's toys, clothes, and a small, tattered diary. The diary belonged to a young boy who had lived in the house years before, a boy who had been reported missing, a boy who had never been found. The diary detailed his friendship with a man who lived in the attic, a man who would bring him toys and sing him to sleep, a man who had promised to keep him safe, to protect him from the world outside. The last entry was a single, chilling sentence. He says we're going on an adventure today. He says we're going to a place where no one will ever find us. The man in the attic had not been a harmless drifter. He had been a predator, a monster who had preyed on the innocence of a child, a monster who had lived, undetected, in the very heart of a family's home, a silent, unseen threat that had been there all along. The sounds Leo had heard, the footsteps, the humming, the rocking, had not been the sounds of a lonely old man. They had been the sounds of a monster who had been living just a few feet above his head, a monster who had been watching, waiting, and perhaps even planning. This story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural entities, but the very real dangers that can hide in plain sight in the most unexpected of places. It's a story that makes you question the safety of your own home, to wonder what secrets your walls might hold, what unseen presences might be lurking in the forgotten corners of your house. It's a story that will make you think twice about the sounds you hear in the dead of night and the true source of the creaks and groans that echo through your home. Because sometimes the monster isn't under your bed. Sometimes it's in your attic, waiting patiently in the darkness, a silent, unseen resident in your own home. Childhood homes are meant to be havens, places where the monsters under the bed are banished by the morning light, and the shadows in the closet are merely clothes. But what happens when the shadows themselves become the monsters? When the very architecture of your home seems to harbor an unseen, malevolent presence? This is the chilling tale of a childhood home where the darkness itself seemed to coalesce into a terrifying, silent observer, a shadow figure that haunted the hallways, a silent sentinel of dread. Our story follows a young girl named Sarah, a bright and imaginative child of about 8, who lived with her parents in a seemingly ordinary suburban house. It was a typical 2-story home, with a comfortable living room, a bustling kitchen, and a long, narrow hallway upstairs that led to the bedrooms. Sarah's room was at the very end of this hallway, a cozy sanctuary filled with stuffed animals and colorful drawings. But as she grew older, this hallway, once a simple passage, began to transform into a corridor of creeping dread, a place where the shadows seemed to deepen and writhe with an unseen life. It started subtly, as these things often do, a flicker in her peripheral vision, a sense of something moving just beyond her direct gaze. She would be walking down the hallway, perhaps on her way to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and she would catch a glimpse of a tall, slender figure, darker than the surrounding shadows, standing at the far end of the hall, near her parents' bedroom door. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, just a vaguely human shape, a silhouette against the slightly less dark wall. When she would turn to look directly at it, it would vanish, dissolving back into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. She would rub her eyes, convinced it was just her imagination, a trick of the light, a product of her sleepy mind. But the encounters became more frequent, more distinct, and always in the hallway. She would tell her parents about the shadow figure, her voice a hushed whisper, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed too profound for a child her age. They would listen patiently, their faces etched with concern, but they would always dismiss her fears, attributing them to nightmares, or an overactive imagination, or the strange shapes that shadows can take in the dark. They would reassure her, tell her there was nothing to be afraid of, that her home was safe, unaware of the silent, unseen entity that shared their living space, a malevolent presence that seemed to feed on her fear. As Sarah entered her preteen years, the shadow figure became more bold, more intrusive. It no longer just stood at the end of the hallway. Sometimes, she would wake up in the middle of the night and see it standing in her doorway, a silent, imposing presence, its form darker than the deepest night, its stillness unnerving. It never moved, never made a sound, but its presence was palpable, a cold, heavy weight that pressed down on her, stealing her breath. She would pull the covers over her head, her heart pounding in her chest, a frantic drum against her ribs, and she would lie there, rigid with terror, until the first rays of dawn pierced through her window, banishing the darkness and, with it, the shadow figure. But the fear lingered, a cold, clammy hand that clutched at her heart, a constant reminder of the unseen entity that shared her home. One night, the terror escalated. Sarah woke up to a profound sense of cold, a chill that seemed to emanate from within her very bones. She opened her eyes, and there it was, not in the doorway, but standing at the foot of her bed, its form towering over her, a silent, menacing sentinel. It was closer than it had ever been, its darkness so absolute that it seemed to absorb all light, all hope. She couldn't scream. Her throat was constricted, her voice trapped in her chest. She couldn't move. Her limbs were heavy, paralyzed by an overwhelming terror. She could only lie there, wide-eyed and helpless, as the shadow figure slowly, deliberately, began to lean over her, its form growing larger, more encompassing, its silent presence filling her entire field of vision. She felt a cold, unseen breath on her face, a sensation that was both horrifying and utterly alien. And then a whisper, not with sound, but directly into her mind, a cold, guttural thought that was not her own. "You're next." The words were not spoken, but felt, a chilling intrusion into her innermost thoughts, a promise of impending doom. The terror was so absolute, so overwhelming, that Sarah passed out, her mind mercifully shutting down in the face of such profound horror. When she woke up the next morning, she was alone in her bed, the sunlight streaming through her window, the shadow figure nowhere to be seen. But the memory of that night, the feeling of that cold, alien presence, the whispered threat, remained etched in her mind, a scar that would never fully heal. From that night forward, Sarah's life changed. She became withdrawn, fearful, a shadow of her former self. She would refuse to walk down the hallway alone, would insist on sleeping with the lights on, would jump at every sound, every movement. Her parents, concerned by her sudden change in behavior, took her to doctors, to therapists, to anyone who might be able to help. But how do you explain to a professional that your child is being terrorized by a shadow figure that only she can see? How do you convince them that the darkness in your home has taken on a life of its own, a malevolent presence that feeds on fear and thrives in the shadows? Years passed, and Sarah grew into a young woman, but the shadow figure never left. It followed her through her teenage years, a silent, unseen companion that haunted her every step. It was there when she brought friends home, standing in the corner of her room, its presence a cold, oppressive weight that made her guests uncomfortable, though they could never quite explain why. It was there when she tried to study, its silent gaze a constant distraction, a reminder of the terror that lurked in the shadows of her home. It was there when she tried to sleep, standing at the foot of her bed, its form a dark, imposing silhouette against the faint light from the hallway. As she prepared to leave for college, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. Relief at the prospect of finally escaping the shadow figure, of leaving behind the house that had been her prison for so many years. But also trepidation, a fear that the shadow figure might follow her, that it might be attached to her, rather than to the house. On her last night in her childhood home, she lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the shadow figure to appear. And it did, standing in its usual place at the foot of her bed, its form darker than the deepest night, its presence a cold, oppressive weight. But this time it was different. This time it seemed to be saying goodbye. The next morning, Sarah left for college, and she never saw the shadow figure again. But the memory of it, the terror it had instilled in her, remained. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, expecting to see that familiar, dark silhouette standing at the foot of her bed. She would check the corners of her dorm room, the shadows in the hallway, always looking, always waiting, always afraid. The shadow figure had left her, but it had taken something with it, a piece of her innocence, a part of her sense of safety and security. Years later, when Sarah was a successful professional with a family of her own, she would sometimes drive by her childhood home. It had been sold, renovated, and was now home to a new family, a young couple with 2 small children. She would wonder if they had encountered the shadow figure, if it was still there, lurking in the hallways, waiting for a new victim. She would think about warning them, about telling them what she had experienced, but she knew they wouldn't believe her. Who would believe such a story? Who would believe that a house could harbor such a malevolent presence, such a terrifying, unseen entity? But sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and the shadows were deep, Sarah would remember the shadow figure, and she would shiver, a cold, involuntary response to a memory that would never fully fade. She would remember the feeling of being watched, the sense of an unseen presence, the whispered threat that had echoed in her mind. And she would wonder if the shadow figure was still there, in her childhood home, waiting patiently in the darkness, a silent sentinel of dread, ready to terrorize the next unsuspecting child who dared to walk down that long, narrow hallway in the dead of night. This story is a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are not the ones that lurk under our beds or in our closets, but the ones that hide in plain sight, in the very architecture of our homes. It's a story that makes you question the safety of your own house, to wonder what unseen presences might be lurking in the shadows, what malevolent entities might be watching you from the darkness. It's a story that will make you think twice about walking down a dark hallway in the middle of the night, and the true nature of the shadows that dance and writhe in the corners of your vision. Because sometimes the darkness is not just the absence of light. Sometimes it's something much, much worse. There are some childhood memories that are meant to be cherished, warm recollections of innocence and joy that we carry with us throughout our lives. And then, there are memories that are meant to be buried, dark, unsettling experiences that we try to forget, but that linger in the shadows of our minds, waiting to resurface when we least expect them. This is the story of one such memory, a chilling tale of a childhood home where the walls themselves seemed to harbor a secret that was both beautiful and terrifying, a secret that would haunt a young girl for the rest of her life. Our story centers on a young girl named Emma, a curious and imaginative child of about 7, who lived with her parents in an old, charming house on the outskirts of a small, picturesque town. The house was a delightful blend of old-world charm and modern convenience, with creaky wooden floors, tall, arched windows, and a cozy fireplace that crackled with warmth on cold winter nights. Emma loved her home, loved the way the sunlight streamed through the windows in the morning, loved the way the house seemed to breathe and sigh with the changing seasons. But there was one room in the house that always made her feel uneasy, a small, narrow room on the 2nd floor that her parents used as a storage space, a room that was filled with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and the musty smell of time. The room had an odd feature, a section of the wall that was slightly different from the rest, a patch of wallpaper that didn't quite match, a subtle variation in color and pattern that caught Emma's eye every time she passed by. It was as if someone had patched a hole in the wall, but had done so hastily, without much care for the aesthetic. Emma would often stare at this patch, her young mind filled with curiosity and wonder. What was behind it? Why was it different? What secret was the wall hiding? One rainy afternoon, when her parents were busy with household chores, Emma's curiosity finally got the better of her. She slipped into the storage room, her heart pounding with excitement and a touch of fear. She approached the strange patch of wallpaper, her small fingers tracing the edges, feeling for any loose spots, any way to peek behind the facade. And then, she found it, a small corner of the wallpaper that had come loose, curling slightly away from the wall. With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, she began to peel it back, revealing a small hole in the wall, just big enough for her to peer through. What she saw on the other side made her gasp in wonder and terror. It was a small, hidden room no bigger than a closet, but it was not empty. Sitting in the center of the room on a small, child-sized chair was a doll. But this was not an ordinary doll. It was exquisitely beautiful, with porcelain skin that seemed to glow in the dim light, long silky hair that cascaded down its back, and a delicate, lace dress that looked as if it had been crafted by the hands of angels. Its eyes were the most striking feature, large, blue, and so lifelike that they seemed to follow Emma's gaze, to look directly at her with an intelligence that was both captivating and deeply unsettling. Emma was mesmerized. She had never seen anything so beautiful, so perfect. The doll seemed to beckon to her, to call to her with a silent, irresistible allure. She wanted to touch it, to hold it, to make it her own. But there was something about the doll, something about the way it sat so perfectly still, so perfectly poised, that filled her with a creeping sense of dread. It was too perfect, too lifelike, too aware. She backed away from the hole, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind reeling from what she had seen. She carefully replaced the wallpaper, smoothing it down as best she could, and left the room, her thoughts consumed by the image of the beautiful, terrifying doll. She didn't tell her parents what she had found. She couldn't. She knew they would think she was making it up, that they would dismiss it as another one of her stories, another product of her overactive imagination. So she kept it to herself, a dark, beautiful secret that festered in her mind. That night, Emma had the first of many vivid, unsettling dreams. She dreamed that she was back in the hidden room, but this time, she was not alone. The doll was there, but it was no longer sitting on the chair. It was standing, its porcelain feet planted firmly on the dusty floor, its blue eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that made her skin crawl. And then, the doll began to move, its delicate limbs moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. Its beautiful face twisted into a smile that was both enchanting and terrifying. It reached out to Emma, its small, perfect hand extended in a gesture of friendship, or perhaps something more sinister. Emma woke up with a start, her heart pounding, her body covered in a cold sweat. The dream had been so vivid, so real, that she could still feel the doll's presence, could still see those piercing blue eyes staring at her from the darkness. She looked around her room, half expecting to see the doll standing in the corner, but there was nothing there, just the familiar shadows and the comforting glow of her night light. Over the next few days, Emma found herself drawn back to the storage room, to the hidden hole in the wall. She would peek through, just for a moment, just to see if the doll was still there. And it always was, sitting in its chair, its blue eyes staring straight ahead, its perfect face serene and beautiful. But each time she looked, she could swear that the doll had moved, just slightly, just enough to make her question her own sanity. Was its head turned a little more to the left? Were its hands positioned differently? Was that smile a little wider, a little more knowing? The dreams became more frequent, more intense. Emma would dream that she was playing with the doll, that they were best friends, that the doll would tell her secrets, whisper things in her ear that no one else could hear. But the dreams always had a dark undertone, a sense of something wrong, something dangerous. The doll's smile would become too wide, its eyes too bright, its touch too cold, and Emma would wake up, terrified and confused, unsure of what was real and what was just a product of her troubled sleep. One night, the dream was different. Emma found herself in the hidden room, but this time, the doll was not alone. There were other dolls, dozens of them, all sitting in a circle around the beautiful, blue-eyed doll. They were all different, some old and worn, some new and pristine, but they all had one thing in common: their eyes. They all had the same piercing, intelligent gaze, the same unsettling awareness. And they were all looking at Emma, their collective gaze a weight that pressed down on her, stealing her breath. The beautiful doll stood up, its movements fluid and graceful, and began to speak. Its voice was soft, melodic, like the tinkling of wind chimes, but the words it spoke were chilling. "We've been waiting for you, Emma," it said, its blue eyes never leaving her face. "We've been so lonely, so very lonely, but now you're here, and we can be friends forever. You can stay with us, in our special room, and we can play together for all eternity." Emma tried to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, her body paralyzed by an overwhelming terror. The other dolls began to move, their porcelain limbs creaking and groaning as they stood up, their eyes never leaving Emma's face. They began to close in on her, their movements slow and deliberate, their smiles wide and unnatural. And then, just as they were about to reach her, Emma woke up, her scream echoing through the silent house. Her parents rushed into her room, their faces etched with concern. They held her, comforted her, told her it was just a nightmare, that she was safe. But Emma knew it was more than that. She knew that the doll was real, that it was waiting for her, that it wanted something from her. She begged her parents to check the storage room, to look behind the wallpaper to see what she had seen. But they dismissed her fears, attributing them to an overactive imagination, to the stress of starting a new school, to anything but the truth. The next day, Emma's mother decided to redecorate the storage room, to turn it into a proper guest bedroom. She began by stripping the old wallpaper, peeling it away layer by layer, revealing the bare walls beneath. And then she found it, the hole in the wall just as Emma had described it. But when she peered through, the hidden room was empty. There was no doll, no chair, nothing but dust and cobwebs and the musty smell of time. Emma's mother was puzzled, but not alarmed. She assumed that the previous owners had used the space for storage, that they had sealed it up when they moved out. She had the hole patched and plastered, the wall repainted, and the room transformed into a bright, cheerful guest bedroom. But Emma knew the truth. She knew that the doll was still there, somewhere waiting. She could feel its presence, could sense its piercing blue eyes watching her from the shadows. Years passed and Emma grew into a teenager, then a young woman. The memory of the doll faded, becoming just another childhood fear, another story to tell at sleepovers and campfires. She convinced herself that it had all been a product of her imagination, a vivid dream that had seemed real to her young mind. She moved away for college, then for work, building a life far from her childhood home. But sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and the shadows were deep, Emma would remember the doll. She would remember its beautiful, terrifying face, its piercing blue eyes, its soft, melodic voice. And she would wonder if it was still there, in that hidden room, waiting patiently for her return. She would wonder if the wall had truly contained it, or if it had found another way out, another place to hide, another child to befriend. One day, many years later, Emma received a call from her mother. The old house was being sold, and they needed to clear out the remaining belongings. Emma reluctantly agreed to help, and she found herself back in her childhood home, standing in the room that had once been the storage space, that had once harbored the hidden room and its beautiful, terrifying occupant. The room was bright and cheerful, just as her mother had made it all those years ago. The walls were painted a soft, warm yellow, and there was no trace of the old wallpaper, no hint of the hidden space that had once existed behind it. But as Emma stood there, she felt a familiar chill, a sense of being watched. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning the walls, the corners, the shadows. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was a small, almost imperceptible crack in the wall. It was just a hairline fracture, so small that most people would never notice it. But Emma knew what it was. She knew that the doll was still there, still waiting, still watching. The wall had not contained it. It had only hidden it, only delayed the inevitable. Emma left the house that day, and she never returned. She sold her share of the property to her mother, and she tried to forget about the doll, about the hidden room, about the childhood terror that had haunted her for so many years. But she knew that the doll was still there, still waiting, still watching. And she knew that someday someone else would find it, someone else would peer through that crack in the wall, and the cycle would begin again. This story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things can be the most terrifying, that innocence and evil can coexist in the most unexpected of forms. It's a story that makes you question the safety of your own home, to wonder what secrets your walls might hold, what hidden spaces might exist just beyond your sight. It's a story that will make you think twice about the dolls in your child's room, about the toys that seem to watch you with their glassy eyes, about the things that go bump in the night. Because sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are not the ones that lurk in the darkness. Sometimes, they're the ones that hide in plain sight, beautiful and perfect and utterly, completely evil.